Today, I want to talk to you about the two different kinds of story that exist and how you can use them to add complexity to your story. Now, across the entire breadth and depth of literature, there is really functionally only two kinds of stories. There's the external story and there's the internal story. Now, these terms get thrown around a lot in literary circles, and sometimes different terms are used to refer to the same thing. So Sean Coyne calls it the internal story and the external story. You've got John McKee, who's got his own words for it. I can't remember what they are for now. You've also got John Truby, who refers to it as the character's surface desire and then the character's subsurface need. Now, these terms, like I said, they're referring to fairly similar things with a degree of overlap, but they do refer to two things at the end of the day. The first is the story of what your character does in the world. How does the character change the world? What impact do they have? The second is how does the character change themselves? What impact do they have on themselves? How are they changed by the end of the story? So that's the breakdown, is the character's impact or change on the world and the character's impact or change on themselves. Now, you do not have to have these two stories occurring simultaneously within yours, but it is a great way to add depth and complexity, because while your character might be going to get revenge, might be going to find the treasure, slay the dragon, find the love of their life, and those stories are fine. Those stories are a lot of those stories are like your blockbuster stories. They are what get bums in seats in films, like the typical action movie. The average action hero isn't going through a great character development arc. They're just out there to save the world or catch the bad guy and have a bunch of explosions, car chases, and gunfights while they're doing it. Like, it's still entertaining and there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, if you read a Matthew Riley book, for instance, those things read like Hollywood action movies in a book. And there's nothing wrong with that, because if that's the kind of story that you're after, that's the kind of story that you want, and that's the kind of story that excites you, you can still deliver those stories very effectively without having all of that character arc development stuff going on. Excuse me. Now, the way that you do add that depth and that complexity, though, is while all of that surface level stuff is going on, you have the internal story of your character, which is how are they changing over the course of the story? How are they developing, transitioning, whatever term you want to use it, but there has to be change. Remember, stories about change. Stories are about change. They're about a character being a different person by the end of it, or the world being different as a result of the character by the end of it. So let's say you have your awesome action story. You've got the plotting and the pacing down pat. You know how it's all going to work out, but it feels like something is lacking. It feels like the average person couldn't go through all this stuff that the action hero goes through without changing in some way. Well, that's when you add the internal content story. That's when you add the character's arc, their internal development that changes to their needs. And when you do that, your character suddenly becomes a lot more real. They become a lot deeper. They become three-dimensional as opposed to a sort of trope cutout character. Now, an example that I think is one of the best examples out there of this is the movie Finding Nemo. So you've got Marlin, whose surface desire, or his external story, is, as the title of the movie suggests, Find Nemo. Now, he could have just gone through his journey through the dangers and perils of the ocean, found Nemo, and gone home. And that would have been a perfectly good movie in its own right. Traffic. But it wouldn't be as good as it would be without that internal story that we see of Marlin's. And the internal story is the fact that Marlin has to let go of his need to control Nemo's life. Now, Marlin obviously has that need to control Nemo's life because of the dramatic incident at the start of the movie where I think it was a barracuda. Yeah, it was a barracuda. Wiped out the rest of Marlin's family, and him and Nemo were the only survivors. So Marlin obviously has a great need and a desire for control, because he believes that if he can control everything, he can keep Nemo, his only surviving child, safe. But the movie, of course, takes Marlin through situations where he has no control, where he is not safe, but he manages to come through it at the end. And it puts him in a final scene with Nemo when all of the other fish are trapped in the net along with Dory. Marlin has to let Nemo go he has to let go of his control over Nemo so that Nemo can save Dory and all these other fish from the trawler net. That is his internal story. And that provides a layer of depth to the movie Finding Nemo that is not there if you just have the external story. The external story, of course, being Marlin going through the ocean, finding and rescuing Nemo. So, if you want to add complexity to your story, and you're looking through your story and you're finding it, maybe it's a bit action heavy, maybe it's too heavy on the plot side of things and not necessarily the character development side of things, look at your main character. Don't worry about your side characters or your villains or antagonists for the moment, because if you try cramming too much of this stuff in, the characters won't have time to breathe and express this journey naturally. Remember, Dory didn't really have a developmental arc in Finding Nemo. It was all on Marlin. But look at your story, look at your protagonist and go, okay, how would someone change after going through the events that they go through in my story? What kind of person would they be at the start of it, and what kind of person would they be at the end of it? What is the impact that the events of the story would have on my character? How can I make them develop through those impacts? How can I make them change? The other thing that you can do with this one is, when you have an internal story and an external story occurring side by side, is you can have much more variety in your endings. So most stories are pretty simple. It's character wants something, character goes through struggles and trials, character gets something, resolved. End of story. That's it. It's pretty straightforward, and it's the formula that's existed ever since we were telling stories around campfires. There's a reason that formula has survived for so long. But when you add that extra story occurring in your main story, you can fiddle with the ending a little more. You have an extra tool in your belt. So you can change it so that your character does have a positive development at the end of their story. You know, they might move from like depression or sadness, something negative, to something positive, like hope or belief in the future. They can move from maybe something positive to something negative in their internal story, but they can still get what they desire. So you can actually have a story where maybe everything is good. Everything works out. They address their inner deep need, their deep deficiency in their character that's causing them to hurt them and others around them, but they also get their surface desire. So it's a tick in both boxes. It's the happiest ending that could possibly be. Or you could have it so that your character gets the surface desire, the thing that's moving them through the story. That's the external story. But maybe they don't meet their internal desire. Maybe that broken thing in them is still broken by the end of it. Maybe you flip it around so they don't get the external thing that was pulling them through the story, but they solve their internal desire. They realize that, this thing that I want, I don't actually want. It's more important that I fix myself, or it's more important that I grow as a person, and that causes them to let go of that desire. They find something else more valuable along the way. These, where you've got a bit of good mixed in with the bad endings, these are what are called ironic endings. I find those endings to be my personal favorite because they're like life. They're bittersweet. Not everyone gets to marry the prince or the princess and then ride off on a white horse and live happily ever after. That's not how life is. And some of the most satisfying endings are the bittersweet ones, because it's a little bit of sadness and a little bit of joy wrapped up in each other. The other ending is, of course, the two crosses in the boxes. The character doesn't get the surface desire, the external thing that they're pursuing. They don't get to change the world or have an impact on it, and they don't get to fix whatever thing is wrong with them. They don't get to address whatever flaw is inside them that's causing them to hurt others and people around them. So, quick summary. There's two kinds of stories. There's the internal story and there is the external story. The terms around these they can change a bit, because you've got, for instance, John Truby, who calls it the character desire for the external story, the thing that gets them moving through the story, and then he calls it the psychological and the moral need for the internal character deficiency, or the internal story. So the terms change, but they're broadly referring to the same thing. So adding these two stories, making sure your story has both of these stories occurring alongside, adds a degree of complexity to your story if you feel that your story is missing something. If you're happy with your story as it is, that's fine. There's no need for you to add that, because there are plenty of stories out there that just have an external story, like your action movies, and there's plenty of stories that just have your internal story about a character addressing something about themselves rather than trying to change the world. That's your sort of drama and literary type stories. So these stories can exist together in one in one piece of work, in one story, or you can have them separately in their own stories. That was a really roundabout way of confusing it, but really roundabout confusing way of saying it. But basically what it means is you can have a story that's got both of those occurring alongside, or you can have a story that's just one or the other. The other thing that you can keep in mind with these is that they allow you to manipulate your ending into something that is a bit more complex, something that is a bit more bittersweet with your ironic endings, or something that can be really happy or really sad, depending on how you want to roll with it. So, internal story and external stories. Those are how you add some complexity. Give me more questions, like the video, and as always, happy writing.